Hello, Dr. Whitaker, Mr. Hilly. I'm going to go ahead and begin my video assignment now. The topic I chose, of course, is the Black Panther Party, a social movement that grew out of the civil rights movement of the 60s, lasted up until the early 80s when they basically dissolved on their own and through pretty much warfare by state entities like the police and FBI. Just like to kind of begin an intro that I chose them because they were kind of a social movement of revolutionaries within a broader civil rights movement. I took a more micro approach, if you recall, in my writings. Just like to say that I was very interested in this project and I learned a lot from it. But just to jump right into it, starting off with models of social change and factors of social change, we see that as a movement, first we have to establish, first off, a lot of people forget that they were a revolutionary organization, technically a party that sought themselves as vanguards in the Leninist sense, that a vanguard party would lead the revolution and that a vanguard party would eventually establish a socialist government, a socialist state. In that sense, we have to remember they are Marxist-Leninists at the end of the day. They were anti-capitalist, but within the civil rights movement, this was a little bit downplayed, I feel, and not only that, it was also not the end goal at the exact time. As you can see, they were focused on community efforts. But to jump right into it, get to the meat of the matter, I saw them as a mixture of a materialistic and idealistic model, in the sense that they're dialectical materialists as Marxists naturally, and idealistic because they were seeking to completely overhaul an entire system, the American system of capitalism, white supremacy, and systemic racist institutionalized racism and systemic racism. So I saw them as materialistic and idealistic in the sense they were far more radical than the average liberal protester at the time, but they sought real change. They sought tangible efforts to change their position, change the system itself. And of course, there was a lot of ideology involved heavily. For example, early on, they sold Mao's Little Red Book, to get funding initially. Jumping in to theories of social change, I decided that they were their movement was rooted in the conflict theory of social change. We were taught that the fundamental source of conflict is inequality, and if they were fighting for anything, it was definitely inequality. Black people at the time were facing state violence from society itself, civilians, lynch mobs. It was just all-out warfare pretty much on black people. Poverty, systemic poverty, institutionalized by the state. We have, for example, redlining that began with the New Deal in the 30s, which basically created ghettos, to not get too into it, but that was a policy that had major effects. Jim Crow laws were still heavy. The justice system. There's so many different things you can get into that black people were facing much inequality. It's the same as the working class. Important to remember, as they were Marxist-Leninists. To jump into it a little bit more, they were pretty much they wanted to combat inequality, and that's just basically textbook conflict theory right there. Description of origin. They started off as Bobby Seale and Huey Newton, who more people I guess would know. He's more notorious, I guess you could say. They're both from the South, so naturally they faced heavier racist issues due to the nature of Southern culture at the time. They both moved to Oakland. They went to college, and that's when they became radicalized, basically became Marxist. And basically, they got out of college and realized they wanted to form an organization in which they would combat inequality, of course, and they would focus on a community level on how to fight that inequality. I mean, I give countless examples in my writings that there's so many. There was over 60 um, 60 different community programs, everything from healthcare, feeding children before school, educational classes, defense classes, law classes, everything like that. And so they really made an effort, and they really changed their communities. Basically, of course, this led to conflict with the state, of course, at the time. Um, so that brings us to the change agents, the change goals, target populations, change strategies. If I just give me a second to move down here, let's see. So the change agents obviously were members of the Black Panther Party. I believe there were thousands of members at their peak across the country. There were national chapters. I mean, they even established an international chapter in Algeria because Cleaver, one of the leaders at the time, he got involved with murder and had to flee the country, and eventually started up a chapter in Algeria, of course. That didn't play too much into effect of anything. There was chapters in England even, and that we can really focus on the Black Panthers in America here because while they were out there, it didn't cause that much of upheaval, I guess you could say. If you want to get into it some more, so the Panther Party members were the change agents. Their change goal, of course, was combating inequality, combating the police, combating the state. Their end goal, of course, we have to remember is Marxist-Leninist, is to overthrow the state completely, establish a socialist country, and basically follow Marxist theory in that sense, in which they establish pure equality. Like I mentioned before, well, this actually goes right into target population. They were different from the Pan-Africans and the nationalists and black separatists that you may see in the more Islamic circles at the time with Malcolm X before he kind of changed his mind later on. But they worked with the new left, white people on the new left, like just social radicals. I believe I give. There was a White Panther Party, for example, they worked with. They had issues with certain groups like the SNCC, but overall they worked with the general New Left of the 60s at the time because as leftists, we have to remember that there's the stereotypical disunity, but at the same time overall there is that ideological unity, I guess you could say. Many splinter groups. There was a lot of focus on marginalized groups like the poor, women, even homosexuals, which was obviously revolutionary at the time, and especially in those communities. The target population was pretty much the working class. As leftists, they were more focused on the working class. I mean, we hear a lot today about identity politics ripping the left apart and whatnot, but I mean, that identity politics still played a real role. I mean, it still does because race is an important aspect to the system that we are criticizing here. So while that's important, the working class, for this revolution, for this vanguard party, I mean, it can't just stay in one set of culture. It has to permeate, and this is what people like Fred Hampton, who were the more ideological based, Huey Newton as well. They realized they had to. The working class white man was important too because he would be part of that revolution that they wanted so badly, at least according to their own theories in leftism, of course. Moving on, let's see here. There were strategies they implemented. I considered it a facilitative re-education and power strategies here. They re-education strategies, community service. I mean, obviously, ideology was imparted into all of these different things. They had to be. That's how you maintain your movement, your revolution, your change that you want to enact. Survival programs, like I said, workshops on self-defense. A lot of ideologically driven, but kids were being fed. So have at it whichever way you want to really think about it. For power strategies, they would walk around armed and try to protect their communities. Obviously, this led to lots of issues with the police, shootouts. I mean, there was warfare on the streets. I call them a social movement, not a revolutionary movement, because there was no revolutionary um, catalyst per se that created any type of all-out war against the state, but they still were kind of at war with the state. No matter what, I brought up how, they walked into the legislature in California in Sacramento while Reagan was giving a speech actually outside. And, two of the guys with loaded guns accidentally walked onto the floor, and they thought, the lawmakers thought they were all going to get shot up. And it was just one of those instances in history where, you know, it shows that they were a social movement more so because a revolutionary group would have went in and killed politicians, where they were just making a statement. They invited the journalists themselves to prove the point. Without going too much longer, um, the type of social movement, like I said, they were revolutionary social movement, not a revolutionary. Was not They were not enacting the revolution itself at the time. They were a revolutionary social movement in the sense of what they did, like countless examples, marching on Sacramento legislature with armed, which is crazy, thinking about it now, and back then, of course. Survival programs, these community programs, establishing chapters across the globe. I mean, these giant rallies of thousands of people that, you never really hear about in history, but they brought out thousands of people to the rallies, and, they were revolutionary in that sense. The theories that went along with these, I said the rational choice theory, of course. Their organization was formed, or like their origins, it was formed to solve the problems of the black community in America, and eventually the proletariat itself. Once again, community programs. Their communities were not getting the assistance they needed through societal channels. They thought if their communities could be self-subsistent, then, they could begin the grander process of the greater goal of the greater good, eventually, of course. And then also the Neil Smelser's value-added theory, because they recognize social strains, structural strains, I should say, inequality through institutionalized systemic racism. They sought to combat that with their organizing. Emergent ideologies arose, like socialism, even Maoism, to a certain extent. Charismatic leadership, Bobby Seale, Huey Newton, Fred Hampton, Eldridge Cleaver. These were the architects of the BPP, and eventually led to their downfall. They were involved with a lot of violence with, wardens of the state, and Fred Hampton, he was murdered in his sleep. The Black Panthers fired one shot. The police fired about 90 shots. They were being murdered and slaughtered pretty much wholesale. A lot of members were killed at the time, and eventually, there's a dark side. There was drugs. A lot of people joining weren't really down for the cause. More so, they were just being a part of something, a group that had a capacity to change through violence, but not revolutionary violence anymore. And eventually, the group dissolved in 1982 because of this. But overall, the effectiveness of what they changed, like what I always love to bring up, and it even gets me emotional thinking about it because it's so amazing. Like the federal program for to get kids school breakfast. I mean, that was started by the Black Panthers in the 60s, and the federal government eventually kind of copied that system itself. That was a big influence on the feds. I mean, and these people were killing these people, and eventually they influenced them. And I always thought that was a big deal. A lot of social programs like that are based on a community level. The Black Panthers were some of the first people to do that, so that's a huge, that's one of the effects of the change that they were causing. I mean, that's huge to me. That's bigger than a lot of other groups can ever say. And the end result, like I said, they eventually dissolved. Their memory lives on in a lot of activists. There was a lot of bad. There was a lot of good. Overall, I think it's important to remember them when facing certain issues, especially today. Very controversial, but resistance is big again. It was during the Bush era, of course. The left kind of died down a little bit during Obama, but it's back again. Um, and overall, the Black Panthers definitely made their mark in history. And I appreciate your time, and thank you. I very much enjoyed the class. Thank you.